open up the public hearing. Mr. Simmons, come on down.
I don't know if this thought is introducing an unnecessary complication, but I would like to see in this ordinance that a person is allowed to modernize the interior of the house because they might be held to duplicating what they had. Some of the houses are older, they might want to do something with a kitchen or something. Now the other one, which may be more questionable, but if it's otherwise legal that a person during the restoration of the house could add a room, say, to the house, making it more livable. Whether there's any way, something equivalent to that. In other words, it'd have to be without variances and various other things that it would work. Because maybe some of the houses are a little small or too few bedrooms, and that they could add a room if it's otherwise legal and acceptable. If you could think about incorporating whatever the actual language would be in the ordinance. Maybe not at this time, maybe that could be added later.
Are you talking about just adding, just because they need an extra room, or if it's destroyed by 51% in the rebuilding, they add an extra room?
In the building, they add an extra room. I don't mean building a castle or something exaggeratedly different from what it was. Thank you.
I'll let,
I think it's already there.
I think it's already.
I'll let our expert discuss that.
Bear with me a second here. I think both of Larry's questions actually already have been answered. I will say that you can modernize it. We don't regulate the inside, and in fact, the fire department would likely require you to sprinkler it, which would be a reason for modernizing. I don't want to say, and the ordinance doesn't speak on this, it's silent, that you could change the design of the structure, because as you've also heard from many of those neighbors in the area south of town, they feel that there needs to be some design guidelines. So I don't think we'd want to go from necessarily a Victorian-style house to burn down to a modern house back in its same location without those people having a chance to weigh in on it. In the existing ordinance, it allows single-family structures to be expanded regardless of their conformity today. It says alterations and additions. You can expand an existing single-family residential structure so long as you don't violate the zoning provisions for that zone. So, for example, if you have to have a 20-foot rear yard setback, you can't expand the addition into the 20-foot setback without a variance. But you can expand. So in the case of Larry's example, yes, if theoretically that bedroom would comply with the zoning requirements for that zone, they could in fact add the bedroom on at the same time that they were rebuilding the structure.
But if it encroached into that setback,
Then they would need to apply for a variance.
a variance, yeah.
In other words, they'd have to go through the same process as if they had started with that in mind.
Right, okay. All right. Does that answer your question, Mr. Simmons? Okay. Thank you, David. Any other comments from the audience on the public hearing? Yes, Mr. Bassney.
Ian Besnay, 328 East A Street. I appreciate this being brought before the council. My only concern is whether or not adding in paragraph A and paragraph D3, the time limits makes the notice that had been given to the persons that would be affected by this ineffective, because it is a fundamental change of these regulations by putting in a time limit. And I agree with Mr. Dowswell that there may be other codes or regulations that apply to this, but persons who were interested in this and went to the Planning Commission and addressed this issue and are interested in it, maybe didn't show up today and then now may be being affected by a fundamental change to it. And so I think that's something you should consider before you add language within 180 days, because it does fundamentally change the notice that was given relative to the ordinance. But I think, and on behalf of the people there, And I've owned a piece of property in that neighborhood for some time, that they do appreciate the council taking this kind of action to protect their homes if in fact something untoward happens to them.
Dane, let me understand what you're telling me here, that the only concern you have is that this 180 days has been added because it wasn't noticed,
Yes.
but you're okay with the 180 days?
I think it's in other regulations, as Mr. Dowswell said, but I think that the persons in these affected areas may not have been advised of that, and as they read this, that they would have to get their permit within a year, and then restoration is started and diligently pursued, makes one think that once they get the building permit, if they're diligent in going after it, there isn't a time limit. And then now we're putting one in there. And that, it was just something that came up as a cautionary note with regard to the notice of the ordinance. But I guess more, my comment is that I think the people in these affected areas are appreciative of the council, but I'd like Mr. Dean to express whether or not this is enough of a fundamental change that the notice that has been given needs to be given with that 180-day limit on it, is all. I don't know the answer, and I'm confident Mr. Dean probably does.
Mayor, members of the council may make that change if it wishes. The change actually simply recites a provision already in law elsewhere and attempts to reflect it here so that, in fact, somebody reading this provision of your zoning ordinance isn't misled by not knowing that this limitation already exists. The other thing that I would point out is, as noted, if one were to change the proposal in some dramatic fashion, so that fundamentally the notice to the public was such that whatever it is you're doing, they didn't have notice of, you would have to renotice. I don't believe, even if this were not already in your code elsewhere, I don't believe this is a change of that nature.
A substantive change.
I don't believe this is a substantive change, but the point is well taken, that at some point that line might be crossed in some future zoning text amendment where you noticed a particular kind of amendment and said to people you were going to hold a hearing on that, and yet you didn't actually stay within that subject and you went beyond it, and perhaps people who might have been interested would not therefore show up. But the general subject is what you need to stay with. You are allowed to have changes to the text. That's why we give you a hearing, is so that people can have suggestions and changes can be made. Persons who have an issue with the particular change that you make at this hearing this evening, that's why there is a second reading.
So this is the first reading, we'll have a second reading? then?
Yes.
Okay. Does that
And the
answer?
second reading must be exactly what you read at the first reading.
Right.
Can't change again.
If I could just say thank you, Mr. Dean, that answers my questions and my concerns, and I knew you could.
Okay. Any other public